of Food for Therapy podcast. I'm your host, Marie-Therese Bolden, and I'm so excited because I've invited back Grazyna to our table, sociologist, and the topic for today is about labels. Are they beneficial? How do we handle them? The pros and the cons. And to support this topic is my own shakshuka. So it's Egyptian shakshuka. Shakshuka is a Middle Eastern dish, and you'll find it all throughout the Middle East. And this is my Egyptian version. We will have all the recipes on our socials. I also have a nice mescaline salad with some feta cheese and some balsamic vinegar. So stay tuned, guys. This is going to be a beautiful episode. Grazyna, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Good to have you back. So let's talk about this topic of labels. Why you think it's important?
All right. I'm a sociologist, and Sociology 101 will tell you that the social world can't exist without people having some already assumed, some assumptions about the way interactions will go or not go. Because if we didn't have those understandings and those assumptions, every social interaction would be a completely new interaction. That being the case, we wouldn't be able to do anything at all. We wouldn't know how to react to individuals. We wouldn't know what was expected or what was not expected, the language, the movement, anything. We need to know we are socialized into the world, and by being socialized into the world, we already have these assumptions about how any particular interaction is expected to go. That's labeling.
But you said assumptions. Like what you've just explained to me was we need to have assumptions. Assumptions, I think, are the worst thing you could do with any individual, but they're not labels. I'm talking about labels, specifically labels, and why I think that they can be an actual hindrance to people. Let's say, for example, we use the mental health model as an example. Labels for me, you have to remember I come from a psychoanalytic background. So labels are something that, you don't want to project onto a client because you're missing the complexity of an individual by labeling them. And, if a client was to come in with a specific symptoms, for example, anxiety or depression, and you go ahead and label them as having bipolar or ADHD, there are a lot of symptoms that cross over into different mental illnesses. And so from a mental health perspective, labels can be quite detrimental. Do you know what I'm saying?
Exactly. I don't disagree. Except the whole of the medical and psychiatric system is actually based on labels. That's what they do.
It's based on diagnostic.
Those diagnoses are labels,
right?
So how can you have and whatever the details of any of them are,
right,
we can discuss that. How can you have a mass system that doesn't have those diagnoses in them?
That label, the DSM, the diagnostic system of labeling or diagnosing, is created by psychiatry, and we know that psychiatry is the medical model, right? So it looks at mental health through the lens of medicine, and for that reason, they need labels.
Yes,
they're important in that context.
Yes.
However, in the context of therapeutic, in the context of someone getting better, in the context of someone healing, a label can often be very detrimental. And I say that to you having had the experience of psychoanalysis and knowing that had my analyst at the time told me a label of what I was experiencing, I probably would have taken my own life. These are the symptoms that I had, right? I developed agoraphobia. I had depression. I had anxiety. What else did I have? I had suicidal ideations. I was grieving. At the time, had my analyst looked at these symptoms and said, this is what you are, I seriously probably would have taken my own life. That's how vulnerable and fragile I was. And so from that perspective, I feel as though they can be a hindrance to someone. But I think I think that the decision to know, to want to know whether or not you have a specific ailment or mental condition or illness is up to you. I feel like if we label someone with something, we miss the whole complexity of who they are.
I don't disagree, but I can't speak from a psychoanalytic or
you're speaking from a sociologist.
From a sociological perspective. What interests me is the way, for example, the number of people now that we can see who, say, as adults, having that label of ADHD, having the diagnosis of ADHD has been so helpful to them to understand why their life has turned out the way that they are. And that label has been exceedingly important and helpful to them. I think that you can critique a society that depends upon those sorts of labels and self-labeling to function. I think we can have a lot of critical discussion about what it means to a society where people are saying, "Oh, look, I read this list of symptoms. I have them. This is what I am. Oh, that makes me feel so much better." That's a problem, and we can discuss that as a problem. But the reality is that we have a whole series of systems set up in the social world where diagnosis and labeling is without a doubt one of the most important ways of the social world operating. Now, I may not like that social world, but nonetheless, that is the way that it operates, regardless of whether as an individual, as a therapist, you think that that's not helpful. I don't disagree for individuals, but that's the social world in which we live.
I know, but to your point about the fact that we can label now certain conditions, there's an over-diagnosis and labels of things. Like ADHD, as an example, has a lot of symptoms that bipolar has a lot of symptoms that menopause has, you know? And the thing is that there's a tendency to want to give a diagnosis very quickly without looking at the individual and understanding perhaps their environment, perhaps their genetics, perhaps a lot of other things. I mean, the symptoms I have through menopause, anxiety, heart palpitations, mood swings I had when I started going through menopause, they're consistent with ADHD, right? Depression. And so this is the problem that I think we have with diagnosing very quickly, is that we need to actually understand the complexity of being human. I think we need to, right? The other thing with labels is they can be really, really shaming to someone, right? And kids do this all the time on social media. Someone will get upset, or, they'll show that they're quite emotional, and someone will be called bipolar, or you're a schizophrenic, or you're a psycho. There's a lot of shame associated with labels. And for that reason, again, I say that it can be really difficult, right? To constantly be telling someone that you're a schizo without having any qualifications in mental health, that label could be very detrimental to someone.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. On the other hand, there are a lot of labels that people take on now that are seen as completely positive in lots of ways. And again, we can...
Give me an example.
Okay. The number of young girls who now talk about themselves as gender neutral or trans, or their labels as well.
Right.
Now, I might argue about the political implications of all of those sorts of things, but they are labels that are considered in many parts of the social world in which we live to be absolutely positive, that resolve whatever individual problems a person might have and feelings that they have.
Right.
This label could resolve those problems. Now, I might argue, and I certainly do in lots of ways, that that's problematic, but that is the way that social worlds exist.
Well, to your point, that would certainly help an individual who's struggled feel like they're not alone, right? So I do understand it in that context. Definitely, I understand it. But I like I said to you, from a mental health perspective, and that's the background from which I come, having had analysis and having trained in psychotherapy and all these different modalities, I tend to think that, you know, if I was asked in the context of a client, what do I have? I could look at someone as a bunch of symptoms. But again, there's a lot of crossover with different illnesses, right? Borderline and bipolar and ADHD, and there's so many different and similar symptoms that they have. So I think that in the context of mental health, which is where I'm coming from, it would be important to see the individual as a whole rather than just a whole bunch of labels. If they were being diagnosed by a psychiatrist, of course, the psychiatrist is going to pull a DSM out, diagnostic criteria, and go, these are your symptoms, this is what you've got, right? And it can be helpful from a psychiatric perspective because that's where the medication comes from. But I don't know. I'm in two minds about what they do.
Possibly, you could have that. We could say that you could be in many minds about it, depending on what the situation is. But I always think, for example, the whole issue of what happened, for example, in the 18th and 19th century, when Britain and countries like it started implementing age of consent laws. Okay. So that by the mid-19th century, there was a certain recognition that aristocratic men in particular, because there were no age of consent laws, would be able to take advantage of all sorts, of many young women in particular and girls in particular. And so we started bringing in age of consent laws.
Right.
And effectively what that meant is that young girls started being treated as children, and children as children were seen as having less power and in more need of attention than adults. And I would say that's fantastic. And the corollary of that is that the men who wanted to have sex with those children or young people, or those girls under a particular age. So it started off as 12 and then 13, and then it rose to in Victoria it's 16. They were seen as having, you might call it a medical condition or a deviant condition, the deviant label of pedophile. And we live in a society that ethically and morally, and I would agree personally, say that their behaviour is wrong. Whether it's a medical condition or not, I don't care. That behaviour is wrong.
Right.
The point is, we have just labelled that behaviour, which 150 years ago didn't exist as a behaviour.
Yeah.
We've labelled that as wrong, morally wrong, ethically and legally wrong, and a particular medical condition in some
Right.
in some
Well, that's
respects.
law. I mean, we do need to have labels in laws.
Yes, but
definitely.
but it's not just label in law; it's also label in everyday behaviour.
Right. Social norms. Yes,
that's right. So, under those respects, but they are labels.
Right. Yes, they are.
They are labels.
Well, they are necessary for like you said, for the functioning of society, an orderly functioning of society.
But sometimes the orderly functioning of society, like I would argue that we've medicalised so much behaviour that the orderly functioning of society has meant that there is not a normalised, it's a standardising of behaviour, so that people cannot have these little perks and quirks without them being labelled and diagnosed.
And that's the problem.
Yes,
that's the problem.
That's a problem.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I did a 1 minute reel yesterday for one of the social platforms on perfectionism. And of course, perfectionism stems from trauma in childhood. And I know because I grew up being a perfectionist from a mother who was a perfectionist. And perfectionism, I had to explain, is not an actual medical condition, but it is associated sometimes with OCD. And so I needed to qualify and quantify that it was not associated with a medical condition, because I guess that is part of the complexity of what makes a human being individual and unique. You know, she's a perfectionist, but she's kind and she's assertive and she's, you know, you're right in that with all these new labels, it becomes very, what's the word for it? You're right, very difficult for us to accept that we all have our own we're all nuanced, we're all individuals, we all have our own quirks, right? You know?
And when I think about a perfectionist, personally, if you're going to be a neurosurgeon, I want you to be a perfectionist.
Correct.
I may not want to live with you.
Yes, correct.
But I want you to be that. That's what I want.
Well, in the faculty of medicine, we all need perfectionists. Correct. Correct. But it's one of those things that, you know, can be very debilitating for the individual and for people that are in relation to them as well. Creates anxiety, it creates tension, it creates stress, and it's never ending because you're constantly moving towards the unattainable because we're not perfect. We're not. We're meant to be flawed. And the flaws, what's that Japanese art form? Kintsugi? Where
they break the pieces of
and when they're put
china
back together,
yes.
They're even more solid and they're more beautiful in their cracks. And that's, you know, I had a psychoanalyst a few months ago and we were talking about that's what makes an individual so beautiful, is those flaws. Once they've repaired and come back together, that's what makes them so unique, you know.
But I still go back to, because the other thing about labelling, perhaps that we haven't really thought about, except in terms of the pedophiles or people having sex with underage people, others, is the whole notion of social control. And as a society, we need social control.
Yes, we do.
We don't exist without social control. The issue for all of us, all of the time, is to understand what the ethics and morality and value system is under any particular form of social control and what it means. And often we need to change that. That doesn't mean that we get rid of social control. That means we change the parameters.
Right.
We don't exist without it. We cannot exist without it.
And those parameters you're saying are associated with labels.
Absolutely. Well, the parameters, the result of those parameters, once they are instituted, are labels.
Right. Well, like, for example, the consent laws now have been changed by this young advocate of people understanding what consent actually means. And she has, through her own movement, redefined social norms. And the laws have been changed around what consent means in regards to sexual intimacy. And in that context, I think we need, like to your point, I think we definitely need labels because it allows for society to function coherently and cohesively.
Except often we live in a society where there are so many of those sorts of regulations, it's actually hard to work out.
Give me an example.
Well, the issue around the consent laws is that it is fair enough that there is always, it's fair enough to have the discussion that it's, especially depending on age, there is always a way of learning where that line is, and we don't always know what that line means, and we actually learn it through interaction one way or another. But when it's made into law, it has, law by its nature has this rule, and the rule is this is consent and this is not consent, regardless of what the social interaction was and what people understood. And I can well understand. I don't necessarily have much sympathy for a lot of men in particular who argue about, she didn't make it clear what that means.
Well, this is why the laws are changing.
But the reality is, especially when people are young, those lines are not clear until the interaction takes place.
Yes, but this is why, look, I commend her for what she's done, because she understands that consent is a very nuanced word in and of itself, and that if we lead with understanding of consent in terms of empathy, right? When you're with someone in that intimate situation and you empathize with what they want or don't want, then consent is going to be a lot more clearer.
Mm.
So, look, she's amazing. She's amazing with what she's done with her advocacy. She's been able to, really bring to the forefront a conversation that needed to be had, right? Especially when we see what's happening with all these, rape allegations with these high-profile cases where we've got one saying I did and the other one saying I didn't. I think laws do need to change to support changes in society's values. And I think that labels are important in that context, to your point. This is such a big... Go ahead.
I'm thinking about the idea of empathy under those circumstances, because I can't help thinking, and this is totally unscientific, anecdotal observation on my part, that we actually live in a society which is producing more and more people who are not empathetic. That I accept often empathy is genetic, but it doesn't necessarily. Children have to learn to be empathetic as well. And what we're doing is producing children who've never learned to be empathetic.
Boundaries are taught in the home. And I agree with that, right? We teach our children, the behaviour that we model for our children is the behaviour that they, often emulate. And so she's not just looking at it in the context of you're in that situation, what does consent mean? She's looking at it from the genesis of how we can teach our children growing up in families respect around your body, respect around boundaries, respect around respecting someone else's body. If we're teaching our children to respect their bodies and they know their body is sacred and no one can touch it, then they will often emulate that with other people, right? They won't.
We hope.
We hope.
We hope.
The other thing is too around that, look, that could be a whole nother episode, but the thing with, I often have this conversation with my husband, which is it's a really interesting situation in society where if somebody's drugged and they're taken advantage of and they're raped under the influence of drugs, it is deemed a crime.
Yes.
But if someone is inebriated and has been, fed alcohol with copious consumption of alcohol, but someone's actually feeding it to them so that they can take advantage of them, it should be deemed as an infringement as well. I mean,
it is.
Alcohol is.
The definition for 40 years, the definition of rape in Victoria has, if somebody is in a position where they cannot say yes, then it's a no. That's been the case for a very long time. If you are not in a position to be able to say yes, then it's a no. However, but that has been ignored. It has been ignored.
But you see, even that is problematic because when you're inebriated, you're not in your right faculty. Yeah. You're not in the right frame of mind. Your brain is clouded. It's exactly like being on drugs.
Yes. No, but in law, there is no differentiation between being in that condition, whatever the substance was. That's not the case. But
are you sure?
Yes, I'm pretty sure that in Victoria that's always been the case, or at least for the last 30 or 40 years. But that is interpreted in the courts in very different ways.
I know that. And this is where, look, she's done some amazing work, this young lady who's, led this campaign of consent. And she understands that it is a really complex issue. But, as parents, it does start in the home. It does start around teaching our children boundaries. It does start around teaching our children what it means to respect your body and respect somebody else's body. It does start in that way. It also starts with schools, socializing young men to understand that your body is yours and you need to be respectful of somebody else's as well. It's so nuanced and so specific that it could take years for you know what I mean?
I think it also does is it misses the condition of power that certain groups have are given in the social world in which we live, so that and power is not explicit necessarily, and many groups, under these circumstances we're talking about, men take it as a given. They don't. It's not problematized. It's not discussed. It's not critiqued. It just exists, and it overlays everything else. So when we start talking about, oh, you need to be respectful of your body and the rest of it, that the understanding of what belongs to you and what doesn't is something so inherent in who you are that it is completely what's the word for it, unconscious. It's effectively unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
So what we then need is to have a social structure outside of that doesn't allow that to become what an individual uses for their own benefit. And we don't have that structure. We have a structure that allows power to exist.
Right. Yes.
And
capitalism.
That, and not just capitalism, but the whole patriarchy and those groups who
it's all part and parcel of capitalism as well. Yeah.
So then we need to think about how do we put together those individual understandings of how we should live our lives and the structural and the structures actually that exist which allow us to get the benefit out of all of that.
Right. And
I think that's a lot harder to consider. So just as an example, and I wonder whether we're going off topic, but it doesn't matter. I'm going to go off topic. I was sitting I was at Melbourne University. I was sitting out in the sun, and a bunch of young people. I think they were Chinese. I think they were new students, but they came as a group, and they were being shown around, and they were taking lots of photographs and selfies.
Mm-hmm.
Now, lots of them were pointing to the spires at Melbourne University and taking selfies.
Right.
There was one young woman. She had quite high wedgies, and she was taking, like, the poses that she was taking, the individual poses she was taking, were these incredible come hither poses.
Right.
And I have no doubt that young woman had no idea really what that means. That more than likely nobody's pointed out to her that she has just sexualized herself and put herself in a vulnerable, powerless position. Those the come hither poses, the little, and she did the little girly, but the sexualized girly poses for herself, for her whatever she was using those selfies for. And then, but the other side of it is we're told that our bodies are our own, and we can do what we like with them, and we should be able to do with what we like with them. But we are never actually allowed to understand that there is an institutionalized push for young girls to put themselves into weakened positions. And it is an institutionalized push. If you have a whole range of social media that says this is going to make you money, this is going to give you fame, and blah 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 blah.
Right.
At the same time as saying, well, it's your body, you can do what you like with it. We have a problem there. And it was just it was an interesting observation. I was thinking about that. What does it mean when we are told that our bodies are our own, we should be able to do what we like with them? But because when we do what we think we like with them, what we do is put ourselves in vulnerable positions. That means we'll be taken
so that's what
of.
that's your takeaway from that situation, is that she's put herself, ostensibly she's put herself in a vulnerable position.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm not saying that there was anybody out there that was going to take advantage of her.
Yeah, to be taken advantage of. Yeah, sure. And what you're saying is that is a byproduct of patriarchy and capitalism.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. And social media structures that come out of that too.
Well, that's part of capitalism, definitely. And probably patriarchy as well.
Well, mind you, there's lots of social media in China as well, and it's not a capitalist society, and it's structured in particular ways. Women don't have exactly great positions in China either. So,
Well, I think that those social norms are learnt in the home. I think I've mentioned this to you. I grew up in a home where there was always this tension around being autonomous, independent, and educated, and getting out in the world and depending on myself, not on a man. But then there was this flip side of the feminine mystique, where my mother was beautiful. She was very sensual. She had amazing charisma and sex appeal. And so there's this constant push pull, like towards feminism, but then it's towards the opposite end of the spectrum. And it leaves you in this constant state of tension and bewilderment about what you ought to do. You know, I learnt from a very young age, growing up in a domestic violent home, that one, I was not like my mother, and I would never enter into it. I could spot the men that I knew were going to be abusive. So I never dated anyone in that situation or like that, thank God. But I also learned at a very young age that my ticket in life was to use the way I looked to get what I wanted. And to a certain degree, it opened some doors. However, the doors might have been opened quicker, but I still had to prove myself. I still had to work for it. And then you get to an age where you go, this is not going to last forever. And that's not who I am. You know, the introspective part of me that looks in and is constantly questioning, and I'm a voraciously curious person, wants to know beyond this body what is there, was like, this is all fluff. It means nothing, because once we die, that goes, and then what is there? You see what I'm saying?
I can see what you're saying.
We learn it in the home. My mother didn't sit me down and say, you need to, this is how you seduce a man. She didn't need to do that. I just watched her, right? I watched her with my dad. I watched her use intimacy with him in a way that would punish him for what he was doing. These are things I watched and I witnessed. So I grew up with this sense of this constant push-pull. My own ideology, my own thinking, as I evolved through psychoanalysis, was that I needed really to depend on myself, and that it's not about how you look in as much about how you contribute to society, how much you give back, what you do. That's your legacy. People remember how you made them feel, not how you looked. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes. Yeah, but then I think about the number of women who have used their good looks to actually gain the financial security that they think that they need, but in doing that, actually lock themselves in.
No, I mean, that's not something I would ever
No.
entertain.
I'm not. But
you marry for money, you pay for life. That's the reality.
Yes.
That's not something that was ever even part of my. It's not even part of my thought process.
No. But how many young girls that may not necessarily be their overt thought process.
Well, that's big.
But the thought process is, if they want to be popular, that's what they have to do to be popular, and to, in some ways, to be secure.
It's really interesting that you say that, because that's a label, being popular. I mean, I was never the popular girl at school. Yeah. I was the underdog, right? And I was okay being an underdog, right? I didn't need to be the popular girl in school. I was an individual, and that is something that I identified in myself and in other people very quickly. The thing that makes me curious about you is your difference. The thing that excites me about you is how unique you are, not how homogenized you are. I'm not interested in that. I mean, that's, you know what I mean? So I don't know. I just think that there are a lot of labels for women. There are a lot of labels for women. And women, I mean, as much as we've come so far with the movement of feminism, and even that as a label sometimes concerns me, the word feminism, because it's been hijacked and used in a way to denigrate men, used in a way to put men down, used in a way to shame all men, and to say that all men are, abusive or hostile or treat women with disrespect is ridiculous. It's like saying that all women are whores. It's ridiculous.
It is ridiculous. On the other hand, I would suggest that clearly you don't need all men to be abusive or rapists or anything else. You only need a small number of men for a large number of men to take advantage of it, even if they don't realise that they have taken advantage of it.
Right.
And I'm thinking about structurally. I'm not making comments on any individual.
But that's what we're talking about, right? This is not. This is not a conversation about specific people.
No,
it's more to do with what are we doing with these labels? I mean, feminism is one that really bothers me because I've been asked the question often, "Are you a feminist?" And I kind of pause when people ask me that, and I say, "Well, what is your definition of feminism?" If your definition of feminism means that women and men are equal socially, politically, economically, then yes. If your definition of feminism is that you want to eviscerate all men, you think they're all whatever, then no, I don't partake. For that reason, I don't like the label, you know? And that's feminism, manifestations, mental health. That's another term that's been hijacked.
I think the mental health one is really interesting. I actually think the label of mental health is really interesting because often what we're talking about is mental, when people are talking about specifics, they're talking about mental illnesses and not mental health at all.
Right.
So that, but what it does is it then draws everybody into its orbit. So it suggests that we're all, it's possible to happen to any and each of us, you know, the problems. And the reality is it's probably not.
What do you mean the problems? Most people do actually have a mental illness in their lifetime, at least one.
Well, that actually, if we're talking about labels, that's a problem that I have. They have the statistics that suggest that, you know, 1 in 4 of us are depressed, for example. What they are is studies that have taken, put out a list of all of the symptoms that come under the auspice of a particular mental illness, and the questions in the study are: have you experienced any of these particular symptoms in the last year, in the last 6 months, in your lifetime? And that is then turned into 1 in 4 of us are depressed or have a mental illness. No, all we have is a series of symptoms that may or may not contribute to a mental illness. We're not mentally
that's
ill.
to my point, is that we cannot define a complex and complicated individual by a set of symptoms.
No, I agree. That's right. Yeah,
that's what I said from the get-go.
Absolutely, I don't disagree. What I would suggest is that in the social world as a whole, that without labels we can't operate on an individual or a structural level. But I agree. But the thing about saying that, and you can see it in the way that people talk about it, that if we talk about and we agree with the suggestion that we're likely to have a mental illness, or each of us are likely to have a mental illness in our lifetime or to suffer from it in our lifetime, what that means is that those of us who are on the end of a spectrum of illness, so that we have a certain period of unhappiness for various reasons, we are part of the same system that also deals with those who have very severe psychotic reactions, for example.
You're saying that they put them all together.
They're all put together. On the one hand, to make sure that everybody is scared and that the funding will be there.
See, that's the point I made in the beginning, is that if you look at ADHD as an example of symptoms, and you compare that to bipolar, and then you compare that to borderline, there's about 10 symptoms that they all share, right?
Yeah.
And for that reason, labels can be hindering.
Yeah.
They can hinder. So, but we're going to take a quick short break and come back with some tea and some more on this wonderful topic that we could sit here and talk about forever. I'm Marie-Therese Bolden. Come back and join us in just a moment.